Guys, today we'll tell you what are the best 4-star weapons in Wuthering waves, taking in consideration the Craftable, Gacha and Pioneer podcast options. Let's go. First of all, something that applies to pretty much everything in Wuthering waves, the best buffs you can seek from any kind of source, so weapons, echoes and so on, are crit, attack percent and general damage bonus. The reason is that these three stats often buff the entirety of the character's kit. Attack percent is more volatile than the others because it depends on which the main scaling stat of the character is, so for example it can be HP percent, defense percent, it just depends. But as of right now, the vast majority of characters in Wuthering waves scale off attack, so it's particularly valuable at the moment. Other than these three, you can also find buffs like damage bonuses that only apply to a specific damage type. So for example, heavy damage bonus, liberation damage bonus, skill damage bonus, and so on. These are only buffing a fraction of the character damage, and so they're typically inferior to more general types of buffs. Specifically, it's usually inferior compared to the main scaling stat buff. The latter is not even significantly worse than general damage bonuses, so naturally it's better than specific damage type damage bonuses most of the time. The point I'm trying to make here is that weapons that have at least one or even more of these three buffs are typically better, more versatile, and more future-proof compared to others. So with this premise, let's look at the best craftable weapons in the game. Craftable weapons are obviously the ones that you can only obtain by crafting them, and they have a peculiarity. Most of them have an energy regeneration secondary stat. While this is not extremely unique in the game, even within 4-star options, because for example weapons like Cadenza offer energy regeneration through the secondary stat and the Concerto energy through the passive, the craftable ones are a bit more interesting to me. The reason is that weapons like Cadenza, Marcato, Discord go all in on the supportive side of a character because they only offer energy tools. Meanwhile, some craftable options, namely the Broadblade, the Rectifier and the Gauntlet, offer energy regeneration secondary stat and offensive buffs through the passive. This can potentially make them a better fit on characters that can deal a lot of damage but also need some energy regeneration stats. However, they have a flaw. They provide more energy regeneration than most of these characters would ideally need. In fact, the energy requirements of characters like Ji Yan, Kalkaro, Ling Yang, Yanlin rarely go over 130%. This means that some of the energy regeneration stat they provide is not that valuable, and as a result they can end up performing much worse compared to their 4-star options. Of course, this assumes that for the other 4-star options you can take care of the energy requirements through echo stats. The Broadblade is the one that suffers from this problem the least because it offers just 32% energy regeneration, while the Gauntlet and the Rectifier reach 40 and 50% energy regeneration respectively. This kind of puts them in a weird spot because the only characters that have very high energy requirements are supports. These supports mostly offer utility and don't really care about damage, so weapons like Marcato are more useful for them. So the energy regeneration craftables are potentially interesting, but at the moment they unfortunately don't have much of a use case. Meanwhile, the Sword and the Pistol go all in on the offense, providing an attack percent secondary stat and an offensive passive. This currently makes them relatively better than energy regeneration craftables because they end up competing rather well with other 4-star options on their respective characters. Between the two, I consider the pistols better because they come with a passive that provides a pretty versatile attack percent buff, while the sword provides a heavy damage bonus buff that is only available if you're below a certain HP threshold. This makes it better for a character like Danjin that naturally operates at low HP than it is for other characters. On the other hand, the pistols are relative to much more premium options across the board, like for example the Pioneer podcast pistols. It scales a bit worse with dupes, but it generally stays at about the same level. Overall, this is pretty great, considering that there are nice damage dealers like Mortefi or Chixia that can use it. So I would say pistol, then sword, and then the other options have potential, but at the moment they're just a bit worse. Next, let's talk about the gacha weapons, but first let me remind you that if you enjoy my channel but you haven't subbed yet, please consider doing so because it really makes me notice your support. So gacha weapons that you can only obtain by polling on banners, quite possibly the most random way to get anything in this game. There is a large variety of 4-star weapons you can get this way, and the interesting thing about it is that some of them can be very specific. For example, Dauntless Evernight and the Amity Accord give a big defense percent buff to the secondary stat. Their general value is low because most of the characters in the game don't benefit from that, but the ones who do really like these weapons. Specifically for somebody like Yuan Wu that scales off defense, Amity Accord is the best option period, even better than a 5-star weapon. The reason is that the 5-star option, in this case Abyss Surges, comes with an abundance of attack bonuses that Yuan Wu doesn't really need, and so Amity Accord just dominates here. The other defensive fancy scaling character in the game is Tao-Chi, that however is more utility based than anything else. For her, a more supportive option like Discord that provides energy all around can be more useful. This weapon is just optimal for a character that doesn't care about the damage it deals, and Tao-Chi perfectly fits this description. On this note, there is one such option for each weapon type. As you probably already got, these weapons are typically exceptional for supportive characters and not just for the energy regeneration they provide. In fact, the unique thing about them is that they provide concerto energy through their passives. Concerto energy is what allows you to get outro skills, and on supportive characters most of the time what you want is just to get that off as fast as possible to switch to characters that can actually deal damage to opponents. By getting extra concerto energy you can minimize that process, and that's just amazing. So for units like Baiji, Tao-Chi, Berina, it's a no-brainer and the best option you can use. Additionally, they can also be used for hybrid characters like Mortefi or Sanhua. So units that deal some damage but are not the main damage dealers of the team. Their function is still to support the main DPS through their outro skill mostly. These weapons can shorten the rotations and potentially improve the DPS of the whole team, so they're worth mentioning here. Regarding the offensive weapons, there are a lot of different options that all do kind of different things, so I'll go over all of them saying what I like and what I don't like. For the broad blades, there is Helios Cleaver that I don't really like because it has a passive with a pretty long build up to get the buffs. I don't really like weapons that have a build up because it means that you will deal less damage at the start. So for example, with characters like Kalkar or Jiyan that can deal a lot of damage at the start of the rotations, this weapon won't buff those instances, which is not optimal. And even with its effect averaged, it's considerably below than the Pioneer podcast option that we'll see later. Still, it's a better option than the Craftable as of right now, which I guess is nice. For the gauntlets, there is Hollow Mirage, another weapon with a pretty interesting passive. This one gives you plenty of bonuses that however get lower if your character gets hit. While ideally you clearly never want to take damage in this game, there are some characters like Ling Yang that have pretty wonky mobility, and so they make it quite hard for you to avoid taking damage completely. So to stay fair, I assume you get hit once per rotation with this weapon. Still, it performs pretty well, competing evenly with the Pioneer podcast option, which is pretty great. For the pistols, there are Nova Burst and Undying Flame. The Flame one is on the weaker side since it provides a pretty specific skill damage bonus, but Nova Burst is nice because it provides attack percent every time you dash or dodge, so pretty common actions if you want to stay alive during combat. However, it also depends, because somebody like Mortefi, for example, that has pretty short rotations might not need to dodge during his actions. Meanwhile, for somebody like Chixia that can be a main DPS, it definitely becomes more consistent. Still, it's pretty good overall, but it's just that with the craftable pistols being so good, it's hard to call this one a great value. It's arguably the best 4-star offensive pistol, but there is a lot of competition on the same level. For the rectifiers, there is Jinsu Keeper that is pretty darn amazing, honestly. It provides a significant attack bonus on intro skill trigger for 15 seconds, so pretty versatile and long-lasting as well. Since the craftable option is not that great, Jinsu Keeper is your best bet at getting a good offensive rectifier without spending money. For these wards we have Command of Conviction and Lunar Cutter. Conviction has a very similar passive to the Jinsu Keeper, so it's pretty strong, while the Lunar Cutter is a bit more restricted. For this one, the holder gets a big attack bonus when he enters the field, but this gets lower every 2 seconds, and the only way to maximize it again is by waiting 12 seconds or killing an enemy. As a result, it works much better on units with low field time like Sauna than on units with high field time like Danjin. Meanwhile, Conviction has a better and more versatile passive that just works better on main DPS characters. Honestly, it's just straight up a better weapon and arguably the best 4-star sword in the game. Moving to the Pioneer podcast weapons, just like the craftables, they're pretty unique. In fact, some of them have a crit rate secondary stat, which is arguably the best secondary stat in the game. Among these, the Broadblade Autumn Trace and the Rectifier Augment stack up incredibly well compared to their alternatives. And it's not just about their base value, it's also that they scale incredibly well with dupes. Compared to other 4-stars, these weapons get massively better as you get more copies of them, and this just makes them very good long-term options. This becomes even clearer if you look at Looming Loss, so a weapon with a heavy damage bonus passive, which is technically weaker than Conviction's passive that buffs attack percent as a whole. At base value, Conviction is better, but when both are maximized, Looming Loss becomes the better option even on a character whose majority of output doesn't come from heavy damage. Still, the gap remains rather small because this is a very specialized option that doesn't even have a crit rate secondary stat. So I personally wouldn't recommend getting this until a very strong sword heavy damage dealer comes out. Stoneheart, the Gauntlet, is in a similar situation because it buffs Resonance Liberation damage, which is not that useful for somebody like Ling Yang. Thanks to its crit rate secondary stat, it remains competitive with other strong options, but at the moment I wouldn't recommend this either. A very similar case to Looming Loss is the Thunderbolt, the pistol that buffs resonance skill damage with the passive. On a character like Mortefi that makes decent use of your resonance skill, it's okay, and scales well with tubes, but not really worth getting it in my opinion. It will probably get better in the future, but as of right now, nah. In short, as of right now, Augment and Autumn Trace are the best options because they have a crit rate secondary stat and an attack percent buffing passive. They're the best 4-stars for Jiyan, Kakaro, Yinlin, Anchor, so all very good damage dealers. The other weapons could get better in the future as more characters come out, but their passives are not really as versatile and so they won't ever have the same general value to me. So definitely get the Broadblade and the Rectifier first. And with this, I'm done for today. If you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe and go check the Yinlin guide I made a few days ago. Bye bye.